It's been more than half a century since the last 55-gallon drum of Agent Orange was sprayed on the dense green canopies of Southeast Asia. The debate about its use, long since relegated to yellowing pages of newsprint, scientific journals, congressional hearings, and scholarly attempts to recount the history of its use, abuse, and deadly devastating consequences. And yet, after all that, there's still another story to be told. And that is the story of the internal policies, politics, and decision-making about the use of defoliants in Southeast Asia that went on in secrecy between the Defense Department and civilian leaders. And that story is told in the thousands of declassified Defense Department records warehoused just outside Washington, D.C., which were seen by me for the first time after their declassification. This massive trove of documents chronicles, for the first time, that the Pentagon's use of defoliants in South Vietnam was a hotly debated and often strongly contested notion among military and political policymakers, planners, strategists, and analysts from the very beginning and throughout the war. The most heated internal debates about the use of defoliants were not over the dangers they pose to human health, but rather the arguments were over whether the principal reasons for their use to begin with were even justified, especially as the war dragged on. The dozens of boxes of unvarnished, unclassified truth shows that the military had long been aware that the saturation of South Vietnam with herbicides was causing more problems than it was solving, but it was ignored and covered up. That's what the records show. Those records show that the Pentagon's massive defoliation program simply wasn't working. Nevertheless, it was allowed to continue. The documents show that within just a few years of the introduction of herbicides in Vietnam, continuing through the early 1970s, there was overwhelming evidence that their use was not achieving the purposes for which they were being used. Introduced in South Vietnam in 1962, the once classified documents reveal that Agent Orange and the other herbicides used were supposed to do three things. First, they offered a means to destroy crops and therefore deny foodstuffs to the burgeoning Viet Cong, or VC. Second, they offered a means to dampen VC infiltration by providing observation corridors to South Vietnamese aerial spotters. And third, they offered support for Allied operations by clearing areas for LZs and fire bases. Between its introduction in 1962 and the end of the program in the early 1970s, the U.S. government dumped upwards of 40 million gallons of Agent Orange on Southeast Asia, according to the Pentagon's once secret records. Exact figures are hard to come by because of the willy-nilly planning by both military and civilian leaders at the time. A secreted 1968 study of the use of herbicides up to that time had found that there had been no effects of any significance from their use. The study concluded that their use was instead doing just the opposite of what they were supposed to be doing, which was winning the hearts and minds of the South Vietnamese, whom the U.S. was supposed to be saving from communism. That report, and many others, documented the negligible benefits from further use of herbicides. What ensued was a major policy review, which, while conceding that the risks of using defoliants did not outweigh the benefits, nevertheless concluded that defoliation efforts should be intensified. Consequently, a clause was baked into all subsequent directives for using herbicides to permit their use in heavily populated areas in those cases of extreme military necessity. But there was an even bigger problem that was overriding all of this, and it was, ultimately, the true reason for why the floodgates were opened on expanding the use of Agent Orange. A sinister reason, actually, that the Pentagon never disclosed to the public. What the once top-secret Pentagon files show is there was a colossal concern over the economic and political fallout that would occur if it were revealed that the government had made a multi-million-dollar commitment to bringing online a government-run Agent Orange production plant, and at a time when Agent Orange stockpiles were overflowing with a surplus that the Pentagon was desperate to draw down, as we'll see. It was that concern that was the central factor in the decision to escalate the use of Agent Orange everywhere and on practically anything, despite the documented fact at that time that it was not achieving the goals for why it was being used to begin with. Yet, by late 1967, but prior to the broad-based policy review of the use of defoliants that took place in 1968, the military command in Saigon pushed for greater use of herbicides, despite the widespread doubts within their ranks about their effectiveness. In July 1967, the U.S. Military Assistance Command Vietnam, or MACV, set forth new criteria for defoliant use. It stated crop destruction should continue to be the highest priority for the use of herbicides because there has never been a question as to the effectiveness of crop destruction. The problem was that admonition was in glaring contrast to what military contracted studies and ground intelligence reports were saying. Only 3 months later, in October, a RAND report concluded that the Viet Cong, or VC, required only 3% of the total food consumed in the country, that crop destruction operations were not in any major sense denying foodstuff to the VC, and that Vietnamese peasants, South Vietnamese peasants, the target of long-range U.S. pacification objectives, bore the brunt of the crop destruction efforts and that they held the U.S. and South Vietnam governments responsible. By that time, the following year, in 1968, there was no doubting that the VC and North Vietnamese Army, or NVA, were not experiencing food shortages due to defoliation. The enemy met their minimum food requirements, a report stated. But there were dozens and dozens of internal MACV reports, memos, and intelligence briefings that supported that conclusion. A 1968 MACV report on the RAND and other studies highlighted that reported food shortages have been the result of Allied sweep operations, not of herbicide operations. But that had already been spelled out in a December 1967 field report to MACV that stated there is no empirical data on the effects of herbicide operations on VC-NVA food stocks, nor is there evidence that enemy combatant operations have been canceled because of food shortages resulting from crop destruction. The report pointed out that the efforts and cost of employing crop destruction is insignificant in comparison to the troop effort required to control and secure an equivalent area of rice. The report established that herbicide operations appear to cause temporary food shortages in areas that are defoliated, and that they have little lasting effect on the VC-NVA food supply. Similarly, a December 1967 MACV briefing paper stated that, within the context of what has been studied, it would appear the crop destruction effort may well be counterproductive. The VC continues to feed themselves, while the South Vietnam peasant bears the brunt of the deprivation and doesn't like it. A 1968 MACV evaluation of crop destruction programs also determined that U.S. herbicide operations had a negligible effect on preventing NVA infiltration into and combat operations in South Vietnam, which was one of the reasons for using herbicides to deny the VC protective cover for infiltration. In short, by 1969, the U.S. policy of spraying Agent Orange over wide swaths of South Vietnam to deny the VC and NVA the use of cover and food was not only not working and unnecessary, but it was also detrimental to the American war effort. The once secret files clearly show that military planners in Saigon knew that the use of herbicides was only partially successful in doing what they were supposed to be doing, and it was turning pro-South Vietnamese peasants into anti-government guerrillas. As one report put it, the obvious reaction of the South Vietnamese peasant whose labors have been destroyed is one of bitterness and hatred. He will frequently direct this hatred toward the U.S. South Vietnamese government for accomplishing the destruction. If he has previously leaned toward the VC, he is likely to side with them completely after crop destruction. The once classified records showed that the U.S. defoliation campaign not only had been counterproductive to the U.S. war effort, but that the destruction by herbicides of valuable resources like harvestable timber and rubber trees was far greater than was reported or admitted by the U.S. during the war. Yet, as public concern over the use of herbicides intensified, the need for a comprehensive herbicide policy was recognized. But it is clear from the minutes of the meetings of the key policymakers that their intent was to allay fears by not only continuing defoliation efforts, but by expanding them and keeping the truth sequestered from Congress and the public. And not only was the U.S. Embassy in Saigon keeping the true intent and purpose of the policy review on the problems created using defoliants from the press, it was also keeping it secret from the South Vietnamese government. During a September 29, 1968 background briefing for the press in Saigon about the herbicide use policy review, the answers provided to questions raised by the press glaringly contradicted what the U.S. government really knew about the negligible effects of the defoliation programs. A memorandum to Secretary of State Dean Rusk, an ardent supporter of the war who retired 4 months later, from Ambassador Bunker, drafted the week before the press briefing, established that the press, public, and even the government of South Vietnam were being deliberately deceived about the consequences of herbicide operations. Bunker told Rusk, "We would prefer not to draw attention, even by implication, to the serious shortcomings the policy review revealed in the aspects of the herbicide programs. Among the shortcomings that were being concealed was the growing concern over the economics of too damned much Agent Orange having been procured to begin with. Indeed, by now, the entire commercial production of Agent Orange had been diverted from domestic use to military requirements in Southeast Asia. Throughout the late 1960s, beginning in 1967, the Pentagon had begun to realize that there were pressing economic reasons favoring the unjustified reason to increase the use of defoliants, especially Agent Orange, which had been wrongly ordered in vast quantities because of the domestic shortage that had been caused by so much of the domestic supply having been diverted to Southeast Asia. Secret briefing papers show that as the Department of Defense was putting into motion its Agent Orange expansion program, orders for Agent Orange were consistently outstripping the military's ability and capability for using it, which had caused an enormous surplus, a surplus that was only going to get worse with a new multi-million-dollar government-run Agent Orange production plant scheduled to come online as a result of the unjustified expansion program. The briefing paper stated that MAC-V could be embarrassed if the plant expansion is carried out and the programmed herbicide cannot be used. One U.S. Air Force colonel put the economic reasons for the unprecedented increase in the use of Agent Orange in vivid perspective. In view of the large inventory on hand, he said, the huge investment in production capability and the future low cost of orange, it is imperative from an economic point of view that orange be used to the maximum extent possible. By the time of the colonel's report, however, MAC-V's overstatement of requirements had resulted in excess quantities of Agent Orange having been purchased, resulting in an 18-month supply on hand in the system, with an additional 8 million gallons per year to begin being produced in December 1969 by the government's facility. The pressure was on. 28 million had been committed for the completion of the plant as a result of Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Nitze, who'd only been on the job for a month, having, on erroneous information, ordered the Agent Orange expansion program on July 31st, 1967, an order that came at a time when MAC-V was well aware that the use of Agent Orange was far less than it was forecasting or had the capability to use. It was also at a time when MAC-V briefing papers were pointing out that MAC-V could be embarrassed if plant expansion is carried out and the programmed herbicide cannot be used. By early 1969, the problem with the surplus of Agent Orange was embarrassingly out of hand. Communications traffic during this time was frenetic, with requests and discussions about reducing the surplus of Agent Orange. As a result, Agent Orange began to be used for every defoliation purpose imaginable, while the use of all other herbicides was brought to an abrupt halt, while new policies governing the use of defoliants were relaxed to draw down the Agent Orange surplus. A memorandum that was part of the decision to halt the use of other defoliants stated that Agent Orange stocks were in long supply and costly contract terminations were involved. Thus, the termination of the use of other herbicides should result in considerable dollar savings from acceptance and maximum use of orange. Another memorandum emphasized the need to use orange in lieu of Agent White to avoid further procurement of white. By now, contracts for Agent Orange were having to be terminated at cost in excess of $1.5 million, with ultimate contract terminations costing the U.S. government nearly $20 million, a reflection of the U.S. government's inability to deplete its Agent Orange stockpile. Finally, on April 14, 1969, the U.S. Embassy buckled to the pressure and allowed Agent Orange to be used on restricted defoliation targets, such as rubber plantations and other valuable natural resources. Agent Orange was now allowed to be used on anything. The embassy said secretly that, for economic reasons, the use of orange is preferred. In other words, large-scale but counterproductive spraying of Agent Orange went forward. Within a few years, though, the outrage over using chemical defoliants had grown so intense, both at home and abroad, that the U.S. eventually was forced to cancel its defoliation operations. But by that time, the damage had been done by a program the objectives of which, all along, were not being achieved by the use of defoliants. And that is the official story of the U.S. government's use of Agent Orange and all the other herbicides that were used during the Vietnam War. They were sprayed, never achieving the reasons for their use to begin with. And that was a fact that was well known at the topmost levels of the government throughout the war, almost from day one. Until next time, my friends, stay well, safe, and frosty out there. And be sure to subscribe, like, and share.